Good morning, everyone. It's so lovely to see all of you. This is the all legislative briefing for the 2023 legislative session. Welcome. As many of you know, every year the Joint Fiscal Office pulls together this important event to ensure we all enter the session grounded in Vermont's revenues and budgetary pressures. And we also take the opportunity to highlight a few policy issues likely to come up during the legislative session. This year's briefing is particularly critical as we come back to review the historic level of federal funds we received from ARPA and deliberate over the best next steps for our state. Senator Balint.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Connor gave me a step stool that made me a little taller than Jill. It seems inappropriate. Here's what I want to say before I get started on my remarks. I can't thank you enough for that welcome. I have come back from 2 weeks of orientation in DC, and one of the things that I heard is that people like me who came up through their legislatures are the best prepared to do the work in this moment. Best prepared. I couldn't be more excited about my incoming class in Congress. Lots of talented people. And from what I hear from the speaker this morning and others in this chamber, the incoming class into the legislature here is phenomenal. So congratulations. I'm so glad you're here. So this morning, we'll be hearing from Tom Covet, who you will hear a lot from over your next 2 years here. And he's going to have an update on revenue and budget and the economic outlook. And you're going to be so pleased because he always sprinkles his presentations with excellent political and economic cartoons. I hope he has not let us down this morning. Oh, let's see. We'll also hear from our terrific joint fiscal staff, Sarah Clark and Maria Bellevue, who will follow with a presentation on the fiscal year 2024 budget context, so we can put all of the information that you're going to be getting in each of your committees in a larger context. Marcia Howard from the Federal Funds Information for States will then provide a federal outlook, and I'll be paying attention closely. I stopped at the rest area this morning in Sharon and was already told by somebody from BGS that I better start bringing home the bacon. So I have my marching orders. We'll then take a break for lunch and hear from Gus Seelig, who's going to provide a housing update, which I know many of you ran on housing. It is a critically important issue here in the state and at the federal level. I know the speaker has set out an ambitious agenda for housing as well. So we're going to hear from Gus and then from Julie Moore, head of A&R, to give us an update on PCBs in schools, and that will close out our briefing. It's going to be an informative, engaging day. And as I was driving this morning, I remembered what it felt like for me, my first all legislative briefing, and you're in for a wonderful, wonderful wild ride. Thank you for serving.
Great. So we want to thank you all in advance for your commitment to participating today, as we know that all of our new members had a thorough orientation last week, and we are all navigating our schedules with less than a month to go before we gavel in for the 2023 session. The Joint Fiscal Office has done a great job getting a full agenda together for today, and we are hopeful that this briefing will provide the needed economic context before we return in January. We love collaborating so much that we want to do this script together. So,
Yeah, that's right.
yeah.
The speaker and I want to thank all of the staff who worked hard, not only to make this day possible, but all on all the evolving logistics during this time of transition, including last week's orientation. We're incredibly lucky here in the legislative branch to have such an experienced, dedicated group of public servants supporting the legislative branch. So if we could take a moment and just thank the staff for pulling this together for us. Thank you. As the returning House members and senators know, the last biennium was unprecedented in so many ways. The challenges posed by the pandemic were enormous for us, for the staff, for your families. And we had to do most of our work remotely, which was not ideal. We felt, many of us, isolated in many corners of our state, but we got incredible work done together remotely. And that is in no small part to the staff that was making it possible for us to do that. We also experienced an historic influx of federal funds, which allowed us to think in new and creative ways. And despite these challenges and opportunities, we worked together with respect, a spirit of collaboration, and we kept
I'm listening now.
first in our minds. That is what we all have to do here in this building. We keep our constituents first in our minds. Together, we made historic investments in housing and workforce and climate and in Vermont families. We have a lot to be thankful for and proud about. But as you know, there is always more to do. And while I will not be coming back to the State House, I look forward to supporting all of your efforts here. We know that when we work together, we can achieve incredible things.
Thank you, Senator Ballin. It has been such a pleasure working with you, and I will truly miss your presence here in the building, but I know you will be back and visiting and representing us well in Washington. Thank you so much. So the legislature has faced many challenges during this time together, but I believe that we have showed that communication and collaboration, we can take on tough issues and get things done for Vermonters. Again, Becca, you will be so missed, but we are all looking forward to watching what you will do for us in behalf of all Vermonters in Washington. This summer and fall, I've traveled around the state, much like Senator Ballin and I did with our ARPA tour, meeting Vermonters in all corners of the state. It was a really amazing opportunity to directly hear from a wide range of individuals and hear their experiences on what was impacting their day-to-day lives and what could be done in the upcoming session to improve our communities. There is still a lot of work happening to stand up programs and get money out the door to Vermonters. I believe that it will be imperative for us to come into this session ready to review the status of all of these programs, to understand what is working and what needs to be adjusted, and to look at the data to inform the policy and budgetary work when we convene for the session. One area that I have spoken to many of you on is the need for additional resources for cities and towns. The level of federal funding was truly unprecedented, but we need to make sure that our local officials have the tools they need to access these funds and make investments that will have a tremendous impact in those communities. I want to reiterate the need for us to be patient as we get started, and remember that we have many new members and many new committee chairs. And the only way we will get legislation passed is for all of us to focus on the goal of making Vermont a better place for future generations to come. A quick update on where we are with making changes ahead of January. The House and Senate Rules Committees, as well as Joint Rules, will be meeting, continuing to meet, and will meet soon to finalize details on what the State House space will look like when we return. And you all will receive updates and have been receiving updates as these meetings and decisions are happening and made. We do know that the HVAC system is not installed, leaving many rooms with compromised air quality, and we will need to continue to be flexible to make our legislative work accessible to everyone. That means that House committee rooms will remain in rooms 9, 10, and 11. However, the legislative lounge will be returned to its previous iteration for members. Let's see who spearheaded that effort. You're welcome. There is a lot of things still evolving here, and I know that there are many questions still to be answered, but please know that you can reach out to my office, to the Pro Tem's office at any time, and we will help you in any way we can. Again, thank you so much. And now I am excited to turn it over to Catherine Benham to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Good morning. It's so wonderful to see all of you here. And I'm thrilled that you all are interested in all the fiscal issues that are facing us. Before we start the day, I have a few things to tell you. I'm asked to remind you to silence your phones. I would also say you will see there are new microphones on the desks here. And when we're going to do Q's and A's after each presentation, there's a button you push, there's a red light that comes on around the microphone to let you know the mic is live, and you just point it at. You don't have to speak into the mic. You can just speak sort of in that direction, point it towards you. I'm sure we'll work that out as we move through this. Finally, the presentations are all posted on the Joint Fiscal Office webpage. If you go to the home page on the Joint Fiscal Office, at the very top, there's a link at the very, very top. It's the first link up there. It has a link to all the presentations today. So let's get started. Tom Cavett has been our economist for 26 years. So he's been through a lot with us. He's seen ups and downs, and he's going to give you a highlight about what might be coming.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Oh, good. We got a cartoon already up. I think it's like the New Yorker, people read it for the cartoons. And I hope some of the dry economic text and analysis, all the rest can be made a little bit more attractive with some of the cartoons. So let's see if we can get this to work here. So just broad brush, starting off, the economy is getting squeezed by two really large opposing forces. On the one hand, there's all this stimulus that's been created over the last 2 to 3 years, which is absolutely unprecedented, phenomenal. And you may think that, okay, that's in the rearview mirror. That money's been spent, that's been allocated. It hasn't all been. So a lot of the money that's allocated has yet to hit the street and is only now showing up as demand in the economy, and there's a great deal more coming. So there's this unprecedented amount of stimulus that has occurred and is coursing through the economy still. And then at the same time, the Fed is trying to slow the economy down. The reason being inflation has been resurgent and is unacceptably high. The fear is that it gets baked in with all kinds of attendant problems with that. So the Fed's putting the brakes on. The fiscal side of things still has foot firmly on the gas, and those two forces are working against each other. So far, the gas is winning. There's a lot more momentum to the economy, I think, than people had thought. When we look at our models about what happens when there's a steep interest rate increase like there has been, you would expect there to be some softening that's occurring. And there are some early signs of that, but nowhere near to the extent that the Fed would like. And so what that means is there's going to be more tightening, and the longer and harder they tighten, the greater the risk is of recession. So that's, big picture, that's kind of what's working on things. But the fact that the economy has been so resilient has meant that tax revenues have come in stronger than expected in the first 5 months of this fiscal year. So a lot of the strength in it, I'm just going to go first to the overall takeaway. And for those of you with printed copies of the presentation, there's one error, and the error is in these 3 numbers here. So these are the right numbers, plus 9.2% above target in the general fund, minus 1.2 in the T fund, and plus 3.2 in the education fund. So T fund and education fund very close to expectations, pretty much on target. And the general fund is up 9.2% on the strength primarily of personal income and corporate income receipts. And the risk with that is that those two revenue sources are extremely volatile. And they're volatile in part because they're backward looking. So you get some liabilities that are coincident, like withholding tax portion of the personal income tax, but a great deal of it is backward looking and is based on estimated payments and on paid liabilities that are collected a year after the fact. So what can happen when things turn, if they turn quickly, is that all of a sudden, not only are your current liabilities lower, but you've overpaid. There's more in estimated payments than is due. And so refunds shoot up. So you can get low paid and high refunds at the same time. It can just crater revenues. So that's a concern going forward. I think, though, it's likely that in January, when we do a full economic and revenue update, that there will be an upgrade in fiscal 23. That's probably likely, but the risks, particularly in fiscal 24, could be a strong swing down. We won't know that until we complete that analysis in January and later this month. But that's the concern. In the T fund, the weakness there is primarily in the gasoline and diesel tax. So those are primarily taxes that are per unit, so per gallon. And so when prices rise, as they have, the demand is reduced, and even with the high prices, our revenues go down. Now, there's a component of the gas tax and motor fuel assessment tax that has a price trigger, but that trigger has kind of a complex formula where it only kicks in when prices are pretty high, and when they're not, there's a middle ground where it is effectively a fixed rate. And even though prices have been high, we're not getting a whole lot of benefit from that in the current price structure. Another thing that is important just in thinking about this, the consumption taxes, which are huge, so sales and use and motor vehicle purchase and use and meals and rooms and the like, those are ad valorem taxes, so they are based on price. So with more inflation, we get more money. And that is all three of those are up like between about 1% and 3%. And that's pretty much what the difference in what we expected in July when we did the forecast and actual inflation have been. So a lot of that is just inflation related. But there are ways in which inflation can assist tax revenues and ways that it doesn't. So most other revenue sources are pretty close to target, but the strength in corporate and personal income is what's pushing that up. So we've been through all the federal money that's washed over the economy, and we keep adding layers to that. The Infrastructure Investment Act is a lot of that was deficit spending, and so that's also in the mix and still coming out. The Inflation Reduction Act has some spending, but larger offsets in the way of tax increases. But a lot of the spending happens early on, and the benefits from some of the tax changes aren't until later. So that's not really something that's likely to reduce inflation meaningfully in the short term. When you look at all that added demand, you can just see, what's happened. Here's sort of all the personal consumption expenditures for goods and services, which is, most of pretty much the economy, and they're moving up. Goods as a share of total personal consumption expenditures has been declining for a long time. All of a sudden in the pandemic, it jumps up. It's an increasing share. All of a sudden, the whole economy has to turn and stop producing as much in the way of services and produce a whole lot more goods. And that's a really hard thing to do. But that's what the economy's been struggling to keep up with this. And with the pandemic, there are all these supply chain issues and the like, which have also kneecapped the ability of the economy to produce what's being demanded. So that increase in demand, services for a long time was below trend. It's now come back, but that just means initially workers from service sector could go to the goods sector, and there could be more production there. And now they're competing for scarce workers. All of this has created high levels of inflation. This goes back all the way to 1948. So you can see, there have been a lot of spikes and everything else, but this is what we're looking at here. And I think the main concern with the Fed is that expectations become entrenched, and then you get baked in inflation that persists for a very long period of time. Their target goals around 2%, not necessarily for the CPI, but for their inflation, preferred inflation metric. But as you can see, it's up. It was up around 9% over the summer, still back down a little bit below 8%, but not where they want it. You can see how the pandemic has skewed all of this when you start to take those inflation numbers apart and you look at the components. So these are just a few selected components that, that show the disparities that exist. But you can see how something like gasoline, as a red line here, dropped way down during the pandemic because people weren't driving. There was a time when the oil and gas producers didn't have capacity to store product because it wasn't being used, and there was actually a negative price in the delivery chain for gas and oil. That changed as things came back and demand increased, and then you've got a war in Europe, in Ukraine, that caused another further spike. That's come down some, but it's still way above where it was, as it's true with a lot of energy products. You can get some things contrary to that, like apparel, men's suits and sports coats. So this is looking at price changes starting in October of 2019, so before the pandemic, and then tracing that all the way through to October of this year. And so men's suits and sport coats are still about 10% cheaper than they were before the pandemic, despite all the inflation that's going on. So there are a few areas like that. Then you have things like eggs. All right, eggs are like super expensive. It has very little to do with demand. It has a lot to do with another pandemic. Bird flu is wiping out laying hens, not necessarily broiler chickens, because chickens only up about 30% over that period of time. Eggs are up 65%. And so again, it's not something that Fed policy that slows demand is going to affect the price of eggs in a big way. But these are all the things that go into that inflation number. And you can just see how there's a story with each one of those that is different and is affected by a lot of different things. And the sum of those is what we're seeing. So here are the things that have declined in price since 2019. A lot of old technology stuff, televisions, calculators, stuff like that. And here's the apparel stuff. Admission to sporting events. Yeah, okay, so they went down for a while. Those will go back up. Ship fare, not shipping of products, but personal travel on ships. Not a very long list. Here are things that have gone up by more than 30%. Saoirse, is that tag at the bottom something you're working on it? Okay, good. So these are things that, again, since October 2019, what the percent change in price has been. So fuel oil, which is heating oil and related to diesel also, up 92.5% since October of 2019. That's over a 3-year period, so 30% a year roughly in price increase. That's substantial. That'll impact the state of Vermont. New England in general uses a disproportionate amount of heating oil for home heating and business heating, but it also runs a lot of the commercial side of things. So things that run on diesel and shipping and that sort of thing, those get baked into other prices that are then a part of the CPI too. You see a lot of food products there as well. You know, we mentioned the eggs, but there are a lot of other inputs to food that are on that, and otherwise energy related stuff. Again, this is things that have gone 20 to 30%. Maybe you can make it out on the handout. I don't know, but it's just a much longer list as you would expect. And again, a lot of food stuff on that too. With the increase in gas prices, it's important to note that as a share of total personal consumption expenditures, gasoline is still relatively low compared to where it has been. So that's an important thing to note. It's a less important share of total consumer spending than it used to be. So anyway, this is what the Fed's doing right here. Big increases in interest rates, still more to come. That'll likely go well into next year and probably top out close to 5%. But again, it will just depend on what happens with inflation and whether they feel like the economy is slowing fast enough and far enough to slow inflation. But what that does is it hits certain sectors way more than others. And one of the most affected sectors is real estate and anything dependent upon lending. You can see here the 30-year fixed rate mortgage has gone up close to 7%. In a lot of markets, it's way over that. So most economists now expect a recession. This is a Wall Street Journal survey of economists. They used to do it every month. Now it's just periodic. This actually may be one reason why there might not be a recession, because economists often get it wrong. So maybe this is a good indicator. I don't know. The thing is, there are really two different camps on what might happen. One is the Fed raises interest rates. Look at every single time that's happened. They raise it aggressively. They say they're not going to stop until inflation's down. That has always tanked the economy. The other side says, with this much money that people have and corporations have in the way of bank savings and all the rest, we can withstand those interest rates for a much longer period of time, and maybe we can even have no recession. So another cartoon, and you're missing the bottom of that, but that quote at the top is from Larry Summers, who was the Treasury Secretary under Clinton and president of Harvard. He says at a certain point, consumers run out of their savings. And then you have a Wile E. Coyote kind of moment where consumption falls off. Once you get in a negative situation, there's an avalanche aspect. So for those of you familiar with the Roadrunner cartoons, guy goes off the cliff and for a minute, he's spinning his wheels, but doesn't, and then all of a sudden falls. So that's one possible scenario, and is important to keep in mind just in terms of hedging risk when you think about budgets and you think about how much revenue we have and how that can be allocated and spent. That is a very real possibility and would play into that, what I was talking about with corporate and personal income taxes. If we look at personal savings rates in October, that number was 2.3%, which is the second lowest ever. And that's how much people save, what percentage of disposable income they save instead of spend. And so that's important because you can see what happened during the pandemic. They got a lot of money. They weren't spending people weren't spending as much, but they banked a phenomenal amount of money. And so now, as things slow down, that money is being drawn off and it's keeping consumption high. The Fed's trying to reduce consumption. I mean, actually, when you think about it, you could slow the economy down in a lot of ways if you want to. You don't have to just do it with interest rates. I mean, the government could raise taxes and pull money out of the economy very quickly, and it would have the same effect. But politically, that's a lot harder. You could also do it voluntarily. You could ask everybody to spend 10 or 15% less. And given that a lot of consumption occurs among higher income groups, that capacity exists. Just don't spend as much for a little while. And that would distribute the pain in a different way. Interest rates and inflation are the other two ways that you can slow things down. And that's what we're choosing to do. So that's the savings rate has dropped, but there's a lot of banked savings, and it shows up in household net worth, along with a lot of other factors. But this is total household net worth. And in the last quarter, notably, that actually declined. So is in part an indication of that, that wealth and savings being deployed and used. This is an update of a table that we had in the last revenue forecast, and it just shows the change from pre-pandemic to now in net worth by wealth percentile group. And the way the Federal Reserve groups those so that they're kind of even is a statement in and of itself, because in order to have kind of comparable shares, the lowest class is not like the lowest 10% or 20% or whatever. It's the lowest 50% of the bottom 50% of the population. Average net worth there before the pandemic was about $30,000, went up to $68,000 through the last quarter. A big part of that increase just recently has been in real estate, because it's the one asset that the lowest 50% of the population has in disproportionate share is real estate. So about 60% of all assets in that wealth percentile group is real estate. Whereas at the high end, because there are a lot of other assets that are owned, it's only about 12%. But you can see the change in net worth has been substantial. And, actually that share in total net worth, the bottom 50% had only owned about 2%, 1.8% of all net worth before the pandemic hit. That's doubled with what's happened in real estate. But there's a lot of capacity, and that's the thing that could change things. We'll just talk about real estate for a minute. I mean, everybody knows the prices are going through the roof. It's really been unprecedented. We are starting, though, to see a little bit of a turn there. Again, it's been slower, but for 14 consecutive quarters, at least 50 states, almost every state, had an increase in price. And that's really extraordinary, a run of 14 quarters in a row where because real estate is a highly regional business. It's not a national market. You don't, just because prices go up in Colorado or Texas doesn't mean they're going to go up in Vermont, New York. So, but in the last quarter, and this is the third quarter of this year, there were 7 states where prices actually declined. And they were in some of the hottest markets: Colorado, California, Washington, Oregon, Utah, Washington, D.C., all had price declines. When we look at this by state, and this is a chart also that you've seen before, but the pink lines are the percent change from the last cyclical peak to now. So if you bought a house at the last cyclical peak, here's how much more it would be worth now. And those are all positive numbers going up. And then the gray lines are if you bought a house at the very bottom when there was a trough after the real estate crash in the last cycle, that's what the percent change would be. And you have a place like Nevada where it just cratered and then, has come back as well. But Vermont's been rising in the ranks there, still is below half, but is now ahead of all other New England states except New Hampshire, which is close, and Maine, which has had the highest growth in New England since the last cyclical peak. If we go back over time, this goes back to 1984, there have been 3 significant real estate cycles in Vermont. These are not always coincident with economic cycles. And I think a lot of people miss this. They're, just because you have an economic downturn doesn't mean that real estate markets will turn down as well. But when prices go up at these kind of levels, I mean, just check that out. So the red bars are actual data points, the green bars are forecasts, but you can see that what's happened here is absolutely unprecedented. And what goes up eventually will come down because incomes aren't growing as fast as that. And ultimately, that's what has to pay for that. But asset classes all around have seen these surges, and the assets will move from one asset class to another. That has big implications, by the way, for the education fund. That's why you're seeing enormous grant list growth, and that will then make it a nominal rate be lower to generate the same amount of money, but it's only because the grant list is increasing. If we look at that break, that same data over time, which is year-over-year change in price for Burlington and then the rest of the state, early on in the recovery, Burlington prices were really widening between the Burlington metro area and the rest of the state. But with the pandemic, there's been somewhat of a catch-up, not all the way, but something of a catch-up. So there's been about 50% price appreciation there. A lot of that has been in the more rural resort areas, not necessarily widespread all the way through the state. So labor markets have been tight, and that's it's one of these good news, bad news things. You can get, a lot of jobs created, good wage gains. You say, well, that's great. Finally, wages are rising. But that's bad news because the Fed is trying to slow things down, and it means they're going to have to push even harder. So labor markets have stayed quite tight. One of the most significant metrics showing that are the number of job openings relative to the number that are unemployed. And that gap, has shrunk a little bit, but not very much. And that's keeping pressure on wages. So we had more than 5% increase in wages in the last period. And that's a number that the Fed would like to see be lower. This is the year-over-year change in total payroll employment. And you can see it's kind of hard to see actually because the pandemic skews the scale on everything. But you can see that there's been a little bit less job growth. It had been closer to 500,000 a month in the early part of this year and late last year. It's about half that, but that's still stronger than the Fed would like. In September, the United States as a whole was back to the same employment level that it was pre-pandemic. Vermont is still below that by about 14,000 workers. So the pandemic has had a long-term effects on labor force participation. You're still seeing rates of absences due to illness that are 50% higher than normal. So even though, the pandemic's over, there are a lot of lingering impacts, and there are a lot of variants that are still mutations that are still being created. And that's still a big wild card in the forecast. Vermont's unemployment rate remains extremely low. Again, an indication that it's difficult to get workers. It's been consistently lower than the US, and job creation has also been lower than the US in Vermont. So here's consumer demand. It's still rising. People are dipping into savings to make that happen. Interestingly, the share of e-commerce has declined, but is still quite high relative to pre-pandemic. And that's probably something that's not likely to change. So good thing that we are getting sales and use tax revenue from that. That was due to the Wayfair ruling. Corporate profits ticked down a little bit. Again, that's a big source of vulnerability, so we're watching that closely. And I haven't really mentioned the pandemic or crypto. We can talk about all kinds of things we go into, but I want to leave some time for Q&A. So if you've got any questions, I'd be happy to respond to those. Yes, sir. Can everybody hear? It's on. Maybe get closer to it. I don't. No.
Testing. Thank you. Whoa. You mentioned that the T fund had dipped because of lower spending on transportation fuels, but I'm curious if any of that can be ascribed to the electrification of Vermont's passenger vehicles.
Yeah, a little bit, but it's not so large to be really significant yet. I think that'll increase. It obviously will over time, but the percentages are still pretty small. But yeah, that's another valid concern. I don't think it explains that underage because we built in some expectation for that. Other questions? Sorry.
I don't know how this works.
Does that work? No?
I don't think so.
It's not.
The light works.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom. Back on the net worth slide that you had, the net worth slide where it showed the different percentages of the population, you didn't speak to the high end, the 1% and the 9% folks. And there was a significant multi-million-dollar increase on those folks, the 1% and the 9% by almost, I think, $10 or $12 million. It was somewhere in the middle. But I'm just wondering if you could speak to that and what was the main driver for their growth in the last 2 quarters? And then for the folks that you said on the bottom 50% of the population selling their real estate, their assets, do you have any projections of the impact of that? If people are selling their homes with the housing market where it's at, I can't imagine they're buying new homes because they're so costly and expensive. So are they now becoming renters, and is this going to cause more pressure on low income people?
Yeah, so I just want to go back to that net worth slide, if you can get back there. So to the last question, it's a change in net worth doesn't mean you've transacted anything. It just means you have probably not, you don't own it. Great, thanks so much. I don't know what happened. Yeah, doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that you have money in the bank. It's that your equity went up in the value, and you probably don't own the thing free and clear. So there we go. So real estate. So the value of the real estate you hold can affect that 68,000 number. That's on a household basis. But to get that out, you'd have to either mortgage or borrow against that. So is that responsive to what you were asking about?
Well, when you said that, I mean, really people just I thought you said it was because people might be selling their
No, it's just that the value of the real estate went up. No, they're not selling. Yeah. I mean, any more than anybody else is, but there's been a shortage of homes for sale, and there's been more demand, and that's part of what's raising prices. So yeah. No, what's interesting about it is just, that the pandemic has, in terms of total net wealth, helped the top 1% and the bottom 50 more than the other two middle classes. Although nobody's really hurting. Your average household net worth went from 3.5 million to 4.3 million for the 91 to 99%, and 616 to 759 for the next 40. So everybody benefited, but just a little bit more on the two ends. Other questions? Oops, sorry.
Tom, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second.
Okay.
So we're going to turn on the microphones are on. So if they could use the new mics.
Their own mics. Okay, good.
And then because that cancels out on YouTube. So we'll see how this goes.
And how much time do we have?
You have a few more minutes, so we
Few
can
more
take
minutes.
another.
Okay, yeah.
So is this working?
See if you get close to that, if it works. If
Is
not-
this working? No? Yeah. Off.
On?
It's on?
Nobody
right.
can hear?
All right. Thank you. Tom, can I just step back a little bit and kind of on behalf of everybody especially everybody who's new here about your role as an economist, you were using the word normal a lot. And I just want to make clear that from your perspective, normal is just what is and not what could or should be based on our policy choices. It's just a result. Is that accurate, in terms of, can you just talk a little bit about what where economists sit in terms of describing what the results of policy is versus recommendations toward policy? Thank you.
Yeah, no, when I talk about normal, like I say, what's the share of total personal consumption expenditures on gasoline? I'm using a 10-year prior average before the pandemic, or something like that. So a normal, the pandemic has skewed so many things that you kind of have to talk about, well, what was the world before? That's kind of more the norm. And then where are we now? And there's some things that have shifted that aren't going to change. I think remote work, for example, is something that is really showing that it is quite persistent. Productivity hasn't gone down in a lot of areas that have embraced it. And the workers themselves tend to really like it, those that can. So there's some things like that will be new norms. But when I'm talking about, normal, I'm generally referring to some statistical average in the past, not any qualification, better, worse, anything else. Yeah. Other questions? Sorry. Thanks for finding everybody. I appreciate that. Yeah. Yes. You'll need the mic.
Okay. Thank you so much. My question is regard to the unemployment rate. So I saw that Vermont has, I guess, the third lowest unemployment rate in the nation. Am I correct that that does not count those who are not currently looking for work? And I have a follow-up to that.
Yeah. Yes, this is the most commonly used unemployment metric. There are about 6 of them. But this particular one excludes people that aren't looking for work actively. So, yeah.
I had recently read an article, and I don't know how accurate it is, that the mental health crisis and the opioid epidemic was causing a lot of people to fall out of the workforce because they were no longer able to due to their health situation, or even in some situations with overdose, passing away, unfortunately. Do we have a sense of what that amount of people who are not currently looking for work due to things such as mental health, opioid addiction, and other issues like that are not having them in that unemployment rate right now?
Yeah, there is a metric that is unemployed due to reasons of illness. Now, what gets categorized as illness sometimes is borderline, but they don't break out cause of the illness. So we saw that spike with COVID. There are obviously a lot of people that were out of work due to illness, but then COVID also created some other increases in illness, particularly mental health related illnesses. And so that definitely has affected both the short term, that they have a job, but they're out of work temporarily, and longer term, they're not even in the labor force. So somebody who's not looking for work. The other thing is it reduced life expectancy rather dramatically from 2019 to 2020 by almost 2 years. And then from 2020 to 2021 by 1 year. And that may not sound like a big number. That's seismic in the demographic world. I mean, life expectancy sort of motors along pretty steadily. It takes something gigantic, like a huge war pandemic or something like that to move the needle. And it really did move the needle because it was disproportionately killing and making sick older people, older workers. I think that's an element in the increased number of people out of the labor force because they're retiring either early or more on schedule or on time. And so all those things contributed to that. But yeah, labor force is smaller nationally, and the pandemic is figuring into that. It's another reason the economy can't produce as much. You know, it's driving up wages. So yeah. Tell me if there's anybody else. Okay. Oh, yep. Okay. Oh,
On the e-commerce share of total retail sales, there was a significant jump during the pandemic. Can you break down what e-commerce is? Is this bricks and mortars being replaced, or is this bricks and mortars allowing people to purchase online? How do you disaggregate?
Yeah, it could be a traditionally bricks and mortar type store, like Walmart has has physical stores, but then they also have a website. So those two are tracked separately. So sales from the website would go into the e-commerce bucket, and sales in the store would be a separate metric. And we get those data from the tax department to break apart and look at that also for the state of Vermont and follow that closely. But that's anything that's done electronically, even if the owner of it also has some bricks and mortar store. And one more question here, yeah.
Thank you. Last night at our planning meeting, we had a heated discussion about converting office buildings to apartments. And you just intrigued me with with the statement that remote work is a trend for the future. Do you think it's safe to be looking at empty office space to convert to other uses?
Yes, I do. There's been a pretty big drop in office space demand. A lot of the leases are longer term for office space, so you don't immediately see all the pressure to move, because if you have a lease, you're still paying. But you see it in the new construction data where there's a lot less office building happening. And the conversion to residential, you're looking at all this additional residential demand, both renovation and new construction, single and multifamily. So yeah, I think that is sort of the way the economy would normally respond to something like that, is to say, okay, let's get creative. We have space. It's needed for residential and not for commercial office. So let's convert it. Yeah. Other questions?
How about one more?
What? No
I was
more?
gonna.
I don't see any hands. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Next up, we are going to be hearing from Sarah Clark, the Deputy Fiscal Officer, and Maria Beliveau, the Associate Fiscal Officer from the Joint Fiscal Office, and they're going to be talking about the fiscal year 2024 budget context.
Good morning. All right. Nope. So maybe I can push that. Is that part?
It's not moving.
We're having a little bit of technical issues. Okay. No. There we go. You got it. Okay. Oh, okay, good.
This way, to the right.
Okay, okay, okay. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Joint Fiscal Office and our website. Then I'm going to provide some context for the budget, including a summary of the sources of revenue that the budget is based upon, as well as a discussion of how this revenue is being spent in the current fiscal year, and that's fiscal year 2023. And then I'll touch on developing the budget for fiscal year 2024. Finally, at the end of my presentation, I am going to give you a summary of the different reserves that we have in our different funds. Then I'll turn this presentation over to Sarah Clark, who will walk you through some issues related to federal funds received by Vermont. Those of you who attended the new member orientation last week will be familiar with this slide. It summarizes the statutory responsibilities of the Joint Fiscal Office. We staff the 4 money committees, which includes the House and Senate Committees on Appropriations, the House Committee on Ways and Means, and the Senate Committee on Finance. In addition to providing staff support to the money committees, we also staff the House and Senate Committees on Transportation, the House Committee on Corrections and Institutions, and the Senate Committee on Institutions. We also cover specific subject areas, including state bonding, education finance, healthcare finance, and other areas such as climate change, childcare, and housing. We are a staff of 16, in addition to some consultants, such as the General Assembly's economists that you just heard from. We have other consultants that are assigned to specific studies. One of the primary functions of the Joint Fiscal Committee, which we all work for, is to accept things of value into the state, such as grants, while the legislature is not in session. This slide shows the front page of the JFO website. As many of you are aware, our website contains a wealth of information on many subjects. From the budget to revenues, issue briefs on a variety of topics, our newsletter, the fiscal fact book, fiscal notes written for specific bills, and anything you could ever want to know about the Joint Fiscal Committee meetings, including an extensive list of grants that have been both recently accepted and those accepted over the past several years. I know that I've left several things off this list, so I encourage you to take some time and peruse the website when you have some time. This slide summarizes the major funds and the source of money that are deposited into the funds. First is the general fund that you hear a lot about because it's the fund that the General Assembly has the most flexibility with. Much of this fund is spent on base things that must be funded, like debt service and healthcare, as you will see in a later slide. But discretionary expenditures often are funded with the general fund. Personal and corporate income tax payments to the state are deposited into the general fund. The general fund also receives 75% of the meals and rooms taxes, the liquor tax, and several other taxes that can be found on the official revenue forecast document that is available on the JFO website. The sources of revenue into the general fund are also available on page 6 of the fiscal fact book that can be found on the website under the publications tab. I'm putting a plug in for our website. The transportation fund receives the gas tax, 2/3 of the automobile purchase and use tax, and dedicated federal funds. The education fund receives 100% of the sales and use tax, 25% of the meals and rooms tax, 33 1/3% of automobile purchase and use tax, and lottery proceeds. These revenue sources are in addition to the statewide property tax payments. Vermont receives a variety of different federal grants and funding streams. The global commitment funds are associated with a federal waiver that Vermont has received for most Medicaid spending. The global commitment dollar is a combination of federal funds and matching state funds. There are also many special fund revenues that are generally dedicated to support specific activities. This slide shows you a few examples of special fund revenues. We have in here the Fish and Wildlife Fund, the Vermont Dairy Promotion Fund. There's an extensive list that this is just the beginning of. This slide shows you how total funds in the current FY23 budget were appropriated this past May. The budget as passed totaled $8.3 billion. This includes federal funds of almost $3.6 billion. As you can see in the large green box to the left, the federal fund appropriations includes $566 million ARPA state fiscal relief funds and ARPA capital funds. Together, the federal funds represent 43% of the total budget, the single largest expenditure of funds. Something of note about the slide is that the fiscal year 23 budget represents the third year in a row that the total state budget exceed $7 billion due to the federal COVID relief funds. This slide shows you how the $8.3 billion budget is appropriated by function of government. Arranging expenditures by function of government mirrors the way that the budget bill is organized. As you can see, the largest expenditure of funds is for pre-K through 12 education. The pre-K through 12 bar shows all the pre-K through 12 expenditures that are in the education function of government, including things such as teachers' retirement and the cost of administration within the Agency of Education, among other things. This chart reflects education-related expenditures that are in addition to the net education property tax number that you saw on the prior slide. This slide includes expenditures supported by the sales tax and a portion of the meals and rooms tax and purchase and use tax, in addition to a few other sources. I'm going to go back for a second. The second largest expenditure in the budget is for Medicaid and related programs. Additionally, Medicaid is where the largest amount of federal funds is appropriated. All right. An alternative way to view the budget is to look at expenditures categorized by how much is spent on people, such as state employees, space and other operating expenses, and grants and contracts that are issued by the state to benefit Vermonters. The amount spent on payroll for state employees in fiscal 23 is 14% of the budget, and another 8% is used to support operating expenses of state government for things such as fee for space, office supplies, IT hardware and software, payments to the Agency of Digital Services, furniture and fixtures, as well as many other things. Grants and contracts represent 78% of the funds appropriated in the budget. These are funds that go out to local communities, organizations, and service providers, such as healthcare, financial support for low-income, elderly, or disabled Vermonters, and road construction, and federal funds for COVID-19 relief, among other things. This slide focuses on where the largest commitments of general fund dollars live in the budget. The total general fund appropriation in fiscal 23 is just over $2 billion. This chart shows the appropriations were almost 50% of the general fund spending. The Medicaid figure of $665 million represents approximately 33% of all general fund spending. And remember, this does not include the federal share that Vermont receives for Medicaid. It's just the general fund. Second place goes to teachers' retirement, followed by the Department of Corrections and debt service. Most of these funds are spent on things that the state is obligated to pay, restricting the amount of money of general funds available to support the remainder of state government. You'll often hear revenue and expenditures described as base and one-time. This slide defines what we are referring to when we talk about base revenues that are used to support base expenditures and one-time revenues that are used to support one-time expenditures. When revenues are referred to as base, they are part of the official revenue forecast each year, and because of that, they can be used to support ongoing programs and operations of state government. One-time funds are just that, funds that we anticipate to only have for 1 year. They are non-recurring and come from things such as court settlements and special fund balances. Occasionally, these revenues are collected by the state due to one-time events, such as the CRF and ARPA funds that the state received in response to COVID-19. One-time funds are generally used to address one-time expenditures. Examples of one-time expenditures include capital improvements, shoring up special funds that are having a temporary shortfall, equipment purchases, IT projects, and reserves. Year in and year out, there are some typical pressures that must be addressed in the budget. These sorts of pressures include the cost of the current year's pay act that needs to be part of the base for the following year. That's referred to as the annualization of pay act. Also, funding the operation of state government, including considerations for inflation. We need to address unfunded liabilities such as pensions and OPEB. We need to address caseloads and other program pressures within the Agency of Human Services, any initiatives of the governor and the General Assembly, and other base needs as they are identified. Each year, the staff of the Joint Fiscal Office and the administration sit down and discuss what the anticipated budget pressures may be for the coming year, as well as available revenues. This discussion represents a point in time and may change as we receive the updated official revenue forecast in January 2023 to learn more about the pressures on the budget. At this time, we can anticipate that the list of base expenditures on the left-hand column of this slide may be things that need to be addressed in the context of the 2024 budget. As we get closer to the legislative session and after the governor's budget address in January, we will know a lot more. Additionally, the right-hand column on this slide lists some of the issues that we anticipate will be discussed this coming session for potential funding. The General Assembly will have to discuss and make funding decisions on these and other issues as they are identified. The state of Vermont has made progress putting money away in reserve funds. This chart shows the balances in the reserve funds at the close of fiscal 2022. The unallocated fund balance in the general fund is $91.5 million. This figure represents the amount of money that was unallocated at the end of fiscal 22 that could potentially be available to address needs identified in the FY23 budget adjustment bill. The general fund also has a full stabilization reserve representing 5% of the prior year's appropriation, or $87.1 million. In addition, there is $80.4 million in the rainy day reserve, also at the 5% statutory level. This is also referred to in statute as a general fund balance reserve. There is $97.7 million in the Human Service Caseload Reserve. This reserve is available to address caseload issues in the Agency of Human Services. The general fund total reserve is $356.7 million, which is 17.5% of general fund spending in 23. The education fund has three reserves. They had three reserves at the end of fiscal 22. First is an unallocated reserve of $12.9 million, a statutory reserve of $39.3 million, and a reserve for the testing, assessment, and remediation of PCB in schools of $32 million. In total, the education fund has $84.2 million in reserve. At the end of fiscal 22, the stabilization reserve in the transportation fund was $28.6 million, which is made up of $15.3 million unallocated fund balance and $13.3 million statutory reserve, representing the full 5% reserve required by statute. There's ongoing discussion about how much money should be in our reserve funds and how much is enough. This is an important issue, especially during years when money is scarce and reserves become very important. Now I will turn things over to Sarah Clark, who will present the slides on federal funds.
Good morning and welcome. I'm going to highlight some Vermont-specific details related to federal funding. Our partner, Marcia Howard from the Federal Funds Information for States is going to provide a deeper dive into federal funding at both the national and state level after my presentation. As you've heard today and previously, Vermont, like all other states, have experienced an unprecedented level of federal funding related to the pandemic and in recovery from the pandemic. This funding situation in Vermont and around the country continues to evolve, and Vermont has greatly benefited. Specifically, we've benefited from the concept of small state minimums from federal funding. It doesn't apply to all federal fund types, but it is when the federal government will set a floor for the amount of funding that states will receive regardless of their size. Vermont and other small states have been big winners on a per capita basis because of this clause. For example, with both the Coronavirus Relief Fund and within the American Rescue Plan Act, the state and local fiscal recovery fund, Vermont was the second highest per capita in receiving those awards. Essentially, each state received roughly $1.25 billion in each of those programs, regardless of their size. That gave Vermont the opportunity to make some strategic investments that we're going to talk about later. When you look across all COVID pandemic funding, Vermont was the third highest per capita across the country. It's also important to understand that, as is typical with many federal awards, there can be limitations on the use. The funds are for targeted, specific purposes, and it's important to know that some of these programs require a state match, for example, in the transportation realm. This will continue to be a conversation during the upcoming session, and the budget that we build together will need to accommodate the additional match needs as we move forward in understanding these various federal funding sources. Federal programs are starting to return to what I'll refer to as business as usual, where increases to federal funding are being made within existing programs that can contain longer timeframes for expenditure. There have been several vehicles that have provided federal funding to states and to Vermont specifically. The list on the screen reflects a snapshot of those vehicles that my colleague will talk about in more detail. Starting with the pandemic-related funding that included bills like the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan Act, and the Consolidated Appropriations Act. The funding continues to evolve, and we've seen other significant federal legislation that's bringing in dollars to our state, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and more recently, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a climate mitigation-focused bill. The slide here reflects federal pandemic-related funding as of November 30th of this year by federal department. You can see the dark blue shaded areas reflect awards that have been provided to Vermont from the U.S. Treasury. This includes programs like the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the state and local fiscal recovery funds, as well as the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which has provided significant support for housing in Vermont. The biggest portion that you see on this slide is the green section, which are funds from the Small Business Administration that included programs like the Paycheck Protection Program. There's also significant funding. The gray area is from the Health and Human Services Agency that provided a myriad of funding to support provider relief, support for vaccination, COVID testing, etc. All in all, this has reflected roughly $11 billion of support to the state of Vermont. Focusing on Vermont specifically and how we invested some of these funds, the FY22 budget bill, or Act 74 of the 2021 session, established multi-year funding priorities for the American Rescue Plan Act, state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars, as well as other state and federal funds. Priorities, and what you see before you is the language from the actual bill. Priorities were set in the following categories. Economic development, workforce, and communities is one category. Housing, broadband and other information technology projects, climate change mitigation, and clean water initiatives. In addition, funds have been set aside by the legislature to support the administration of these important programs. Goals were established in each of these categories, as you can see on the slide, $250 million for all categories with the exception of clean water, which is at $225 million. This slide details the status of the appropriations through the end of last session towards these funding priorities. This includes on this slide not only federal dollars, but our investment of some of the one-time general funds that have continued to come to the state of Vermont. The green arrow reflects the target of $250 million across the economy or economic development, workforce and communities, housing, broadband, and climate action mitigation. And the blue arrow is the $225 million target. You will see from an appropriations perspective, Vermont was able to make a lot of progress towards these major priorities. However, it is important for us to continue to focus on assessing and understanding the rollout of these investments and the progress being made on delivering these programs. Last week, the administration provided an update on these programs that while they have made significant progress, one of the tenets of standing up these programs is making sure that they're administered in a way that is in compliance with federal guidance. So that has created a slight delay, though they are moving forward now on many of these important programs, and I expect it'll be a conversation this session. During the upcoming session, these are some fiscal themes that I expect to be part of our dialogue. We will focus on funding base expenditures in our budget with ongoing revenue sources, and we'll make strategic one-time investments using available one-time dollars. As my colleague Maria indicated, it's important that we match ongoing revenue sources with ongoing expenditures and one-time with one-time. We'll, as always, need to continue to be diligent about the revenue outlook in the future years, that we build a budget and a construct that we can sustain. And we'll want to continue to understand and maximize our federal funding resources as that landscape continues to change and evolve. And we'll want to assess and understand the status of the investments that we have made to date. You'll see this last slide has our contact information as well as the link to our website. I'll take the opportunity to give our website another plug for the myriad of, I think, what is very useful information. Thank you.
Are there any questions? And just to give you an update, they're going to do some adjustments on the mic system at lunchtime while we're out. So for right now, we're going to use this handheld mic, and then hopefully it'll be better when we come here.
Thank you for the information. You didn't mention, is the federal funding time, I know it's time limited, but does it all end at one particular time? How long do we have to spend that money?
Great question. So it really depends on the source of the federal funding. So when we look at some of the critical direct aid to states that the federal government provided, for example, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, that actually has already had to have been expended. When we consider the American Rescue Plan Act, state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars, which is another altogether with the local funding, roughly $1.25 billion. States have until December 31st, 2024 to obligate those funds. and they have until December 31st, 2026 to expend those dollars. I think as you look across the myriad of other federal programs, the timeline on those can vary.
When you give figures for federal funding, does that include funding that the state gets through incentive grants if certain things are met, like Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act money or adoption and legal guardianship money? And if so, is that assuming Vermont meets all those incentives?
So I think I want to make sure I understand your question. Are you asking about specific requirements associated that Vermont must meet in order to draw down federal dollars for specific programs? So maybe I can answer generically and we can follow up with you on the specific programs you're asking about. As I indicated, there are limitations on use of some of the federal dollars. And so in order for Vermont to be able to successfully draw down and expend those dollars, they have to expend them in a very specific manner that meets the criteria and requirements of the federal government. And we're actually audited on that on an annual basis. However, I think there are some funding streams where there may be requirements to meet certain benchmarks in order to earn those dollars. And I think that may be what you're specifically referring to. And so we can dig into the specifics of that program and follow up with you. Yeah, so I think, and I think what I would say is that the agencies and departments, when they submit their budget, are going to make the most appropriate assumption in terms of whether they'll actually be able to leverage those dollars, because it brings up a good point that you don't want to assume a federal revenue source if you think you're not going to get it. And so the expectation would be they would make kind of do a risk assessment and make sure they're not assuming revenue that they may not be able to achieve. And it's certainly part of the conversation that can happen in the appropriations committees to make sure that we are on target to being able to draw down those dollars.
If you all would join me in thanking Maria and Sarah for the presentation on the budget. Next, I'd like to introduce Marcia Howard with the Federal Funds Information Service. She has provided, for over many years, she's provided very useful information to all of us, to the various states on the various federal opportunities, et cetera. So Marcia, welcome.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Catherine. Good morning, everybody. Nice to be here. I'm not allowed to have favorite state capitals, but it's pretty close. Okay, so Sarah did a great job of covering some of the basics of the federal funds that Vermont has received and continues to receive. So I'm going to go over that pretty quickly, but if you have questions, of course, I'm happy to entertain those later. So looking back, looking forward, I'm not going to tell you a lot you probably don't know. I'm just going to try to maybe present it in a narrative that maybe, because it all happened so fast, right? I mean, we hit March of 2020, and it was like a boom, 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 boom. And you kind of got whiplash trying to keep up with it. So now we have a little time to step back and say, okay, what in the world happened there? And where are we? So let's go. Looking back. A lot of new federal spending was implemented because of COVID. So if you look at this chart, you can see in 2019, federal outlays from the federal budget were about $4.4 trillion. In 1 year, they jumped to $6.5
trillion. That's a big one-year increase, right? And then continued to rise to 6.8 trillion in 2022 or 2021. We don't have the 2022 number, but part of what I'm going to talk about is about all the things that happened in 2022. So my expectation is that when we get that 2022 number, it's going to look probably quite a bit like 2021. So this chart looks at how much federal outlays for grants to state and local government, what you all get, have been in dollars, and what the percent change was from the prior year. So again, you see the run up from COVID. It was pretty rising, but at a modest rate. And then you hit 2019, 2021, and you see that big increase. In 2021, it was a 50% increase from the prior year. And of course, this you felt it. You felt it at the state level. So this one shows how much states received collectively in grants to state and local government, and how much that represented as a share of state spending. And these data come from the state budget officers on the executive branch side. So again, you can see in 2019, it's up around, north of $600 billion, but then it jumps to $1.1 trillion between 2019 and 2021. And it jumps from 31% of total state spending to more than 40%. And I know that NASBO has reported that 2021 is the first year in the history of their record keeping that federal funds were the single largest source of state revenues. Usually it's the general fund, but in 2021, there was so much federal money out there that federal funds were the largest source of state spending. So 2020 started out like normal. We hit March. The coronavirus arrives on the US shores. The amazing thing to me about this, these are the 4 bills that passed in fiscal year 2020, federal fiscal year 2020. And what's amazing to me is 2 things. One is that you look at the first one and it was $8 billion. And as I say, it's almost quaint, to think. And yet $8 billion, we'd consider that real money under normal circumstances. But as you look down, you see, oh my gosh, you can barely even see that bar there. The second is that 4 pieces of legislation passed the US Congress in 2 months. So this is what I mean about the whiplash, because it was just like boom, boom, boom. And of course, the largest of these, the CARES Act, is the one that brought the first coronavirus relief fund. But to summarize these, one of them had the 6.2 percentage point increase in your Medicaid matching rate, which remains in effect today and which we'll touch on a little bit later, because obviously it's a lot of money and it's important. And then the CARES Act was the beginning of kind of this more robust flow of federal funding coming to the states. So I've listed here some of the main components. And again, if you want to talk about any of those, we can come back to them. And then 2021. So we went from April until December, kind of letting this all play out. And then in December, we get another big piece of federal legislation that was part of the appropriations bill, about $900 billion in federal assistance. And then in March 2021, of course, we get the American Rescue Plan, which is the really big one and the one that we talk about mostly when we talk about COVID. And that was $1.9 trillion in federal appropriations. And in these 2 that were enacted in 2021, this is a summary of some of the big components that targeted state and local governments. And you see the American Rescue Plan does have the longest list. The state and local fiscal recovery funds, obviously, is the biggest sort of pot of what we call not really free money, but very flexible money that's available to states. And as Sarah mentioned, available until the end of 2024. So still there, although most states have obligated it. Just capital projects funds getting announced, continuing the state small business credit initiative ongoing. We're tracking these things and still updating these things every single week because there's so much money out there that is making its way to states as we stand here talking. So the summary of all of this is that over the fiscal years 20 and 21 primarily, we're tracking the flow of all of these funds to states. And we're tracking it in two categories. One is grants. That's what y'all get to use. And then the other is non-grants. And so over the course of this period of time, it's been about 1.4 trillion in grants and 3 trillion in non-grants. Non-grants, what is that? Those are the economic impact payments that your citizens got. Those are unemployment benefits. Those are paycheck protection loans. Those are the economic injury disaster loans, things like that, that don't go to Vermont government. They go to the citizens of Vermont, the businesses in Vermont. So they're not grants, they're direct payments. So in total, just about $4.5 trillion that we're tracking that we can trace to the 50 states. That jumped. Okay, there. So we got through 2021, 2022 begins pretty calm. And then in November, we just had the 1-year anniversary, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was enacted, the infrastructure law. So we're tracking right now it's a little higher than this now. I think we're up to about 740 billion that we're tracking in our spreadsheet of grants flowing to states through this bill. This chart shows the breakdown of where those funds are in terms of program areas. And it also distinguishes whether they're new grants or existing grants. So the big bar is highways, and you can see transportation is the top 3. Most of the money is existing. There's some big new money in there. Notable, I think, is commerce, where you see the $48 billion, and that is the new big effort on broadband, which I think is a big issue in Vermont, I imagine, given the rural nature of the state. So that's in the works. Here are the two main things I want to say about the IIJA. The one is that big programs dominate. There are 15 programs listed here. They account for 2/3 of all the money coming from that bill. So even though there are a lot of programs that you can compete for and be eligible for, it is very top-loaded, and especially top-loaded in highways, although you will see the 42, the third bar, is for this broadband equity, access, and deployment, known as the BEAD program, which is just launching sort of recently. The second thing about the IIJA is that while it funds hundreds of programs, if you total on the left, you'll see it's more than 200 programs that were funded in the bill. And most of them are competitive grant programs. So Vermont is not guaranteed to get money. You have to apply, you have to win those funds. But most of the money in the IIJA is going to flow by formula. So you're going to get what you're going to get because it's already codified in law how much will flow to the states. So the vast majority of the programs are competitive, not the vast majority, the majority of the funding is by formula and guaranteed. Now, still, there's a sizable minority there that is either competitive or some combination of competitive and formula. But federal formula funds definitely dominate that. So that was the first thing that happened in fiscal year 2022, beyond like regular appropriations. And then late in the summer, in response to the Uvalde school shooting, Congress came together and passed something called the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So this provided what we've identified as about another $4.6 billion in grants that will flow to state and local governments through 3 departments: education, justice, and HHS. So that was just added to the money flowing in 2022. And the key things about this is that all of these programs are existing. There's nothing new here. While there are some competitive grant programs, there are 4 formula grant programs, and they represent about 2 billion of the 4.6 that we've identified. So again, it's kind of top heavy on where the money's coming from. The funding was all already appropriated, so it's there. It doesn't depend on Congress to do anything more. They've done what they need to do. Most of the money is we appropriated all of this, of which this shall be spent this year, this the next year, this the next year, with some exceptions. And very few of these require a state match, which is becoming an important consideration for many states, and one that I'll touch on again toward the end. So that was in the summer. And then later in the summer, we got something confusingly called the Inflation Reduction Act, which is in fact the climate bill. So we're tracking then, and this identifies $67.4 billion. We're continuing to add, so that too is a higher number of the funds we're tracking in our spreadsheets. And again, you can see where the money is targeted and whether it is an existing program or a new program. So I'll point to like environment, you see it's $20 billion, more than $20 billion, and most of it's new funding. So you're seeing really big investments in areas that have typically not been the recipient of large amounts of federal funds. In contrast, in agriculture, it's 20 billion, but it's existing programs, a lot of which is for easements and whatnot. So that's kind of a breakdown of where those funds will be flowing. And key considerations as you think about these funds are these. The funding is all mandatory. It's all been provided. Again, it's there. Nothing depends on anyone doing anything further. Most of the grants received a lump sum in 2022. So this program is getting $10 billion, which must be spent by, and in many cases, it's 3 or 4 years out. So it's a one-time appropriation with a long spend out period. And this sort of gets to the question earlier about how long are these funds available and how that really differs by program. This one included, it was an Inflation Reduction Act, remember, it included some tax increase. It was paid for. So this is the one where we saw the corporate AMT was part of it, enhanced IRS enforcement to raise revenues, and an excise tax on stock repurchase plans. So this was different from the others in the sense that it did include some revenue increases to offset the cost. The grant number, you may notice, is smaller than it is in other areas. We're talking about things that were up in the hundreds of billions or even trillions. And this one is, relatively modest at 67.8 billion or something. And the reason for that is on the climate bill, much of the federal policy is on the tax side. So there's a ton of tax credits available to individuals, to businesses, and even to states. So if you decide to, do an energy efficiency thing for all of your campus here and, move to heat pumps and whatnot, you can get these federal tax credits as direct payments, or your state fleets as they move to EVs. You can get federal tax credits, or if you're going to throw solar panels up on the state capitol, just kidding. You can get tax credits for these things. And again, these are just starting to roll out now, but states are eligible for many of them. And then finally, the climate bill did, because everything includes health provisions in Washington, because it's so much of what government does at the federal level and the state level. So there's a few minor sort of Medicaid provisions in there as well. So the upshot of all of this as we go through 2021, 22 is that it's a technical term, ton of federal money out there that's been appropriated. We have COVID, where in our spreadsheet, we're tracking and now we're just on the grants. I've eliminated the paycheck protection and the UI payments and these are just the grants. 1.4 trillion in COVID, 731 minimum billion in the infrastructure bill, another 67 billion minimum in the climate bill, and another 4.6 billion in the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So that's $2.2 trillion that Congress has appropriated over the last 3 years that is, kind of new money. Not all of it's new money, because of course in infrastructure, the highway program, I showed you, there's existing programs, but it's still a big boost. And again, to get back to the question of how long do we have to spend this money, I've tried to put the years in parentheses that are kind of mostly covered by the bills that were passed. So you can see COVID, we've got going to 2024, but out a little further. IIJA tends to be 5 years, 22 to 26. The climate bill was more 10 years because tax policies often are. So that's going all the way out to 31 in many cases. And then the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, like the IIJA, is closer to a 5-year time horizon for most of the programs. And then I went to our spreadsheets and looked at the Vermont line to see, okay, how much has come here to Montpelier. So again, these are grants, and this summarizes the COVID grants, the COVID non-grants. Again, this brings back in the Paycheck Protection Program and all those others, the IIJA, the climate, and I don't know if I have the BSCA in there, I may not. So it's $14 billion that we're tracking. And I have to say that on the IIJA and the IRA, we can only track the funds once the allocations are announced. So if the agencies haven't announced it yet, for example, this BEAD program for broadband, those allocations haven't been announced yet. So we can't tell you what they are unless we run the formula, which is based on the maps, which aren't final. So these are just estimates. They're moving. We update them every week. But again, $14 billion so far, as of November 18th, that we're tracking into Vermont. And when we think about these, and Sarah mentioned this as well, it's really important, and I mentioned it earlier, matching requirements. Remember the match, especially infrastructure-related spending almost always has a match. Sometimes you can get it waived, but given strong state fiscal conditions, that's probably a harder sell to make right now than at other times. The additional FMAP and your Medicaid matching rate is not embedded in a lot of the numbers I've reported because CMS has had a lag in its reporting of those numbers. So you've actually gotten quite a bit more because we're not capturing the extra Medicaid money. Speaking of which, someday that extra Medicaid money is going to go away. And someday, and as we're standing here, some of these other programs have been winding down or stopped. As Sarah mentioned, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, it's over. So now we're into the unwinding and the post-auditing. And why did you do this? And how did you do that? And you know, the second guessing of what states did. And a point I make all the time is that a lot of times in federal, in budgeting, and you probably know this firsthand, you have a choice between doing it fast or doing it thoughtfully. And it's hard to do both. And so with COVID, states were encouraged to act fast, go out, spend it, get it implemented, go, 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 go. And now they're going to come back around with the audits, right? And say, well, why'd you do that? And so it's a really hard balance to strike. But this is where we're going to be now for the next couple of years, probably, is dealing with these problems of the post-audit, what they call the post-audits. In the last several recessions, Congress has come through in a big way to help ease state situations and fiscal difficulties related to those recessions. If there is a recession, as some people project in the next year and a half, it's not clear that Congress is going to be quite so willing to step in at this point, in part because, as illustrated, so much of that money is still out there. You know, a lot of it has been spent, a lot of it has been committed, but the dollars will still be flowing. And you know, as we think about inflation running at pretty high levels by recent history, all of this federal money, you know, probably played some part in that. So I think that as states, we need to think, okay, this could be, if there's a recession, it could be different in the sense that there may not be as much appetite in Washington for helping states out. In fact, the appetite seems to be more trying to claw back some of what they've already provided. And then just as a footnote here, as a consideration for Vermont, is that your Medicaid matching rate, apart from the additional, is slated to actually go up with your federal rate in 2024. So that always helps to move some money from the state side of the ledger to the federal side of the ledger. So just a little tidbit of good news for you there. Looking forward, much less to say. We have a continuing resolution that is currently funding the federal government until December 16th. It extends some programs that have to be extended or they stop running. And notably, it didn't do much else, but the continuing resolution did appropriate an additional $1 billion for the low-income home energy assistance program, which is of course vitally important and of high interest in Vermont and the rest of New England. And those funds have already been awarded. So most of your LIHEAP money has actually been, for 2023, has been awarded already. So what we're looking at as we go ahead is how these 2023 appropriations are going to wrap up. Congress needs to get a top line agreement on how much it plans to spend on discretionary spending. And I don't know if you follow this closely or not, but the last couple of days have featured this debate between the House and the Senate and Republicans and Democrats. And the issue is they agree on the top line number, but Republicans want more on the defense side and Democrats want more of it on the non-defense side. And Democrats are willing to accept the Republicans' number on the defense side. But if they do that, then they want to bump up the total so that they can get more money on the non-defense side. And they are so far knocking heads on this. So the question is whether or not, as the 16th now approaches, will a big omnibus bill to fund the whole government, is it achievable? Or will they need to do another continuing resolution? And will they decide to do a full year continuing resolution, which would take us all the way to September and include, you know, what they call anomalies, where there are things like, we can't fund this at last year's level, but, you know, so we have to do this and this and this and this. So they just tack on some extra things and push out to the end of September. And of course, the election is having an impact on how that thing plays out, right? Because the Democrats right now have majorities in the House and the Senate. Come January, the Democrats will have the majority in the Senate, but not in the House. There are many Republicans who would like to scale back spending from its current levels. So for the Democrats, the thinking could be that at this point, it's not ideal to have a full year CR, but it's better than we're likely to get next January. So we'll cut our losses or however you want to look at it. So it's just, you know, the politics are intriguing, but it is all about politics. The public health emergency is what's giving Vermont and every other state additional federal Medicaid dollars, 6.2 percentage point added on to your base rate. It's currently in effect until January. The administration has committed to 60 days notice to states before they terminate it. That means that in November, you would have received notice that they are planning to terminate it in January when this one expires. That notice didn't come. So as far as we know right now, the public health emergency will be renewed in January, which means it will go January, February, March, April to April. And that means the extra FMAP would be in place through June 30th, at least. So this is a can that just keeps getting kicked down the road to the benefit of states and to the cost of the federal treasury. And we'll just have to see how it plays out. Some state legislators at an NCSL event asked me if they could just keep the PHE in place forever. And, you know, they can. I mean, it's an administration decision. The opioid PHE has been in place since 2017. The question is whether, if they do that, will Congress come in and say, okay, you can keep your PHE, but we're decoupling it from this additional Medicaid money and we're stopping the extra Medicaid money. We'll see. And then finally, the debt limit increase is coming up in mid-year of 2023. If you followed federal economy and federal budget for years, you know that this event, when it occurs, is one of the most roiling and unsettling things that happens, not just in the federal budget, but in the national economy, in the financial markets, because there is always a debate over whether they're just going to shut the whole thing down rather than extend it, or if you get our vote to extend it or lift it, we're going to put in place a budget balancing bill that puts restrictions in place. So around mid-year, as this comes into play, it creates anxiety for those of us who actually follow the federal budget, and see how it goes. And one thing that has come up is whether or not in a lame duck session, which would be sometime between now and the end of this month, Congress acts to just go ahead and lift the debt limit or suspend the debt limit to get it out of the way before Congress's composition changes in January. But so far, it's not clear how that will go, but definitely something to keep on your radar. So that's what I have, and we're happy to get your questions. We're happy to get your email addresses if you're not receiving our materials. We update all of the numbers every week. We provide links to the grant announcements and all of these big pieces of federal legislation. We're available by phone, by email, and love to hear from you. So thank you.
Are there any questions? Here's one.
I was kind of hoping this would work. Oh, well. So the first law of thermodynamics says that matter or energy cannot be created or destroyed, but I'm curious how we apply this to money. And as the federal government continues to engage in this deficit spending, how do they ever pay that debt back? And while we have the economists here, I have a question for you, which is, do you have any specific policy recommendations for what we can do on the state level in these conditions to break us free or to get us closer to breaking free from these endless cycles of boom and bust?
Well, I'll say on the boom and bust, as you see there, clearly the gap between outlays and receipts is pretty substantial. It is actually projected to close quite a bit, and some of the tax increases in the Inflation Reduction Act will address some of that. And the other thing I'd like to point out to people is that the last time the federal budget was balanced was around the year 2000. And at that time, federal revenues as a percent of gross domestic product, GDP, were 20%. And they haven't been anywhere near 20% really since that time. So federal revenues, it's not just that spending's going up. It clearly is going up. It's also that over the longer term, federal revenues have been going up. So I'll stop with that and turn it over to the Vermont specific stuff.
Yeah, with respect to cyclicality, we're basically a cork in the ocean. So what happens at the federal level just sweeps aside anything state level that could be done. And we don't have our own currency. So we're not controlling any of that. We can't deficit spend. We have to borrow money and really, pay on it. So there's very little in the way of state policy that can affect anything significant with respect to the broader cyclicality. And that extends to other policies too, immigration, things like that, that are outside of the purview of state government.
Here's another question. Hang on.
Thank you. I'm a grant writer in my day job, so this is like going to Disney World. I'm so excited. It absolutely is. I'm curious about congressionally directed spending, since now they have applications associated with them. Are you qualifying them as grants, and is the state counting that, the state of Vermont counting that in its federal revenues, or since it's leapfrogging down to municipalities and nonprofits, are we just not?
Super timely question on earmarks. That's another reason they want to get a budget done, is Leahy wants his earmarks in that budget. He wants you to get that money. We mostly do not include earmarked spending in the money we track because we are trying to keep it baseline. The one area where they kind of carved the earmarks out of the baseline was in EPA's revolving loan funds. So we might have it in there because it's kind of embedded, but not in general. So that's how we treat earmarks. And then there was a Vermont piece to that someone else needs to answer, right?
Yeah.
So if it's money that's flowing from the federal government direct to like towns or municipalities or other specific earmarks and doesn't flow through the state, it would not be included as part of the money that we're tracking at a state level that's reflects what's appropriated by the state of Vermont.
Thanks for this presentation. It's great to hear about the ton of money and how much is coming to Vermont. Are you tracking the distribution of those dollars within Vermont? Like how well are we doing at getting it to every corner and other ways at looking at how we're doing at spending all those funds that are coming in?
Absolutely not. That's a hard, I mean, it's hard in Vermont and then multiply that times 50. And states like California, there are federal programs, especially USA Spending, that tries to track federal dollars all the way down to where they actually get spent. It's not an ideal tool, but it's there. It's getting better. There's also the pandemic, it's PRAC. I don't know what the acronym stands for, PRAC. And they're doing reporting on how states are implementing. I mean, others are looking at it, but it's a big ask, but we don't.
Thank you. I'm worried about potentially missing some of those deadlines and the fear of federal government crawling back those dollars. I mean, fiscal year 24 is not that far away. And I presume state agencies have contingency planning to avoid that potential outcome. But can you respond to that potential fear of mine?
The last time I looked, more than 90% of the state and local fiscal recovery funds had been obligated by states. I'm sure Catherine's staff, there's Sarah, knows how much has been obligated in Vermont.
We've essentially obligated all of the money coming through the state's coffers.
So that 2024 deadline is of no concern because you've already used the money. In other areas, yeah, your state agencies are going to have to be on top of it because the deadlines come and the deadlines go. And some of these programs you could benefit too, by the way, because some of the programs have provisions for reallocation of unused dollars. If states remit back, then reobligated or reappropriated to allocate it to other states. So it's a win and a lose, but you definitely, that's what I mean about the unwinding in a way, is everyone has to be on those through all of this to make sure you don't get blindsided by any of these things.
So the biggest concern is about not so much what's been allocated, but what gets used. And how do we hold ourselves accountable to making sure that we use what we allocated, since we're a citizen legislature and we're not here 24/7.
I agree with you, and that is an observation that is completely outside my area of expertise. We track the federal money. We let you know how much is going to shower down on your lovely state. And once it gets here, then it falls into your hands to make sure that you make the most of what you have.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking Marcia and the whole group that presented this morning. Before we adjourn, I have one quick announcement. Representative Ann Donahue has noted there is, for those still looking for the most updated COVID booster, there is a walk-in clinic at Berlin today. And she is going to be going up there. If anybody wants directions or wants a ride, I believe you connect with her and you will, she will do that. So now we are going to adjourn. Please enjoy your lunch and we'll be back here